the live button, and we're good.
Well, hey, good Tuesday to everybody here out in CFC social media land. If you're familiar with Tuesday, you know it's the time that I sit down here in front of my computer. Jim sits down in front of his computer, our pastor of media communication and online pastor. And we have this dialogue a lot about what happened on Sunday to look forward. And if you're one of our 500 listeners, and 500 may be saying a lot, right, Jim? You know that if they listen to us, we spend a lot of time just kind of bantering back and forth when we start having some fun things. But today we're just going to kind of hop straight into what we talked about on last Sunday and also look forward to this coming up Sunday, especially in light of just there's so many things going on in our nation right now, specifically though when it comes to the issue of the murder of George Floyd and how that is caused a lot of rightful response and a lot of confusing response. And what does it look like for us as a church to respond, as us as individuals to respond? So yeah, I guess we'll just kind of set up with that, Jim, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start. And so, as we kind of said earlier on noontime prayer, it's been a little bit of a heavy day. I think if everybody's scrolling their social media feed as I am constantly throughout the day, as it is part of my job to do that. And so, a lot of stuff going on, pretty heavy day. So, let's jump right into a little bit of a heavy question. On Sunday, we talked about divorce. Why do you think divorce is such a hot button issue or a hot button subject in terms of churches and church discussions?
Well, even in the way we framed that question, we said we talked about divorce, and the reality is we talked about marriage, right? And whenever we frame any conversation starting with a painful word instead of a positive word, it has the possibility to bring up a lot of things inside of us. I think I used the term trigger word last week in my sermon, and I mentioned, one that I'd mentioned one time with my wife that, I don't suggest anyone do that again. If you didn't hear it, you can skip over that part of the sermon if you go back. It wasn't my finest moment. But, you know, the issue of how marriages break up are so painful as it is. But then I think either by accident or on purpose, a lot of people have taken a section of scripture, especially Matthew chapter 5, and they've used it accidentally or on purpose to weaponize shame and weaponize mistakes on people who have been through something already so tragic. And so it leaves with a lot of concern, a lot of pain, a lot of difficulty. And it makes an already very hard, challenging scenario even more hard and challenging when the people who are called by God to come around you don't seem to come around you more than they seem to kind of pile on in the midst of that. And so in the sermon, I'll say it again today, if you listen to it and you had some questions, because it wasn't designed to be a full treatise on every situation that God says a marriage should be okay to break up or not. It was really Jesus just calling out the fact that they were loopholing marriages as a whole. They were looking for any reason to get out. But it wasn't designed to be a full treatise about all the different reasons it's good or not good to remain married or to break up a marriage. And so I did say that. I've already had several people hit me up, and I'm really grateful that interaction I've had with them already. You can email me here at church, B as in Brian, last name Bales, so bbales@cfcwired.org. And let's talk some more.
Yeah, I was going to say we're always happy to answer questions if we can. You can always email Pastor Brian, or if you're watching this on Facebook, you can send us a message, and we
Yeah.
get that. I see those every day when those come in, and if it's something that I don't feel like I can handle or want to take care of that, then usually I forward that along to Pastor Brian or somebody else who can handle that. So if that's easier than just going over to your mail client, if you just want to hit the message button right here on our page, you can always do that, and we will forward that right along. So. Another question, thinking about integrity, and you mentioned in terms of integrity and words and how we use our words, how do you think the world would see Christians differently if we truly lived by the integrity of our word, as Jesus indicates in 34 through 37?
Well, I think, as I'll mention, even coming up this Sunday, it's not just enough to speak the gospel, it's to be the gospel. And by that, I just mean this, that there are a lot of things that we speak, we know to be intellectually true about Jesus, what he's called us to live and how to be, but we struggle in actually doing them. And it is in the doing them, the actual actions, wherein we participate in what Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We help bring that, and we show the truth about who Jesus is. In fact, one of the struggles that we have a lot, and you may have heard me say this before, Jim, I know that I've said it at least once before in a sermon. is that our very word belief, right? It comes from a Latin word, not trying to sound geeky, but it actually comes from a word that means by life. And especially in the early Christian traditions, especially in the eastern part of the world, no one believes something that they actually didn't actually live. And we live in a Western world where we think we can believe something in our head, but not have to live it out. And I think if we were actually people who said our yes are to be yes, our no to be no, and we're going to follow through on integrity, it would be a shining light into our community, into the world around us, say, hey, these people, they're acting in a way that maybe, and sometimes actually even in their best benefit. It'd be in their best benefit to break the contract or to break their word, but instead they're something different. And much like when we look at the moon, I heard Louis Giglio use this illustration one time, is that the moon is not the light, it's just a reflection of the light. And at first glance, you may think it's the moon giving light, but when you get a little bit older, you kind of make the connection. We're the moon in this analogy, and Jesus is the sun, and we're to be light reflectors, light givers. And I think that would be one of the greatest impacts it would have on our community.
So, looking forward to week 8 a little bit as we wrap up Matthew chapter 5. What do we have to look forward to this weekend?
We use the term coincidence, right, to talk about things that occur, or some sort of strange thing that doesn't have any causal connection. And I think we've all been through some coincidences. But when it comes to coincidence, God doesn't do coincidence. And so this series that we had planned is at least 2 months old. We began tweaking it immediately and looking at doing this series as soon as we went into the shelter in place for COVID. So I believe we kind of landed on this series somewhere around the 15th of March, give or take, around that time. So that's over 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago now. And strategically, by God's design, not by coincidence and providence, we're in a section in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, where it gives these words about how do we respond in the midst of evil. I think that's a good question. In the midst of the racism, in the midst of the pain and the difficulty we're seeing expressed towards people who are made in the image of God, if we're not asking the question, how should we respond? We got our head in the sand, or we're living in a complete world that needs to be rocked and changed. And fortunately for us, there's an answer. God gives us some direction. Jesus does in those 4 or 5 verses. And so this week, we're very much, again, it just amazes me in God's providence and His timing. We're not having to go off any particular series, go to find a different place to talk about the issues of the world, but God had said it and knew even now, this is what we're going to talk about. And so we are going to dive into that this week, and we're going to ask the question about how should we respond if we are the people who are suffering injustice, and specifically for people who aren't the people who are suffering the injustice right now. They're not on the other end of racism. Is it enough just to say nothing? And I think one of the things that we need to really just say right now and prepare for Sunday is not the same thing as doing a good deed. And Jesus makes that really, really clear. When we get to heaven, I don't think Jesus is going to begin to rack up and look at all the non-bad deeds we did for crowns and jewels that we'll get back to him, but actually it's going to be the good deeds. And I think especially those of us who look like me, and anyone who's been a part of our church many times, they've heard me say this. One of our church values is diversity, and I feel so privileged to have so many people that do not look like me who call this church home. And I say this all the time. I feel privileged, to be their pastor, but I also understand that due to my race, even due to the fact that I'm a male, I live in a society that just naturally has a privilege that so many people do not have. And so it's not just enough for me. It's not just enough for anyone who may be in a situation similar like me to say, well, at least I'm not making it worse. Now that's a start, right? That's a start. But God's standard, Jesus' standard, as we've seen all the way through this series, right, has been unprecedented. And so it's one thing to not do any harm, but it's not yet living the unprecedented life He's calling to us to do, to not do harm. He wants us to actively do good. He wants us to be people that seek justice, not vengeance. And I'll talk all of that on Sunday. And then we're going to continue to pray. We're going to continue to pray about how God would have us to respond as individuals, how God would have us to respond as a church, and then follow Him to the best of our ability. Because the last thing I'll say on Sunday is that we can't do this without God's help. It's too hard. And if we're going to try to do any of this that we're called to do in this unprecedented life, certainly tackle the racism that we're going to talk about Sunday, or any other thing that we've talked about, we can't do it on our own power. And so we got to trust Him. So I really hope that if you're listening right now, you are going to make it a point to tune in at some point, rather right there Sunday at 10 a.m. to hear what the Bible has to say, Jesus has to say through the Bible to us, or at some point later on in the week to listen to that and invite others, because it's a message that Jesus knew was going to come this weekend, and we really need to hear.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed that God has a way of working those things together in a way that we didn't plan when we set out to do this several weeks ago
Yeah.
in terms of this series. And I was listening to a well-known preacher this week, and he was talking about the difference between response and reaction. And I
Mhm.
think that's a powerful thing to think about in terms of kind of what you were saying a few minutes ago about how we respond is different sometimes than how we want to react to certain situations. So that'll be a good thing for this Sunday.
Yeah.
So if you haven't or if you have missed out a little bit on the unprecedented series, you can always catch up with that right here on our Facebook channel, YouTube channel. We talked a little bit on Sunday at the beginning about what was happening with some of the issues that we're now dealing with a little bit more in full in terms of racism. And so we'd love for you to go back and check out week 7 if you didn't get a chance to do that at the very beginning of the message. Brian talked a little bit about that. We prayed through that. So but we will look forward to this weekend as we wrap up the unprecedented series. And wherever you're at today, we hope that you have a good Tuesday. So
That's
have a
right.
great have a great day.